Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here. We very much appreciate you joining us today. We're here to talk about secure Gen AI and advancing in the scenarios that involve M365 Copilot and Azure OpenAI. We're going to talk about some strategies to mitigate risks. Of course, we're going to start with how to discover those as well. Focus is going to be the Microsoft stack, because that's where Copilot and Azure OpenAI live, and the native tools that Microsoft offers to manage the threats that everyone would enjoy if they're deploying those technologies. I'm joined here today with my colleagues, Colby and Rachel. Colby, would you mind giving us a quick intro?
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is Colby Maxey. I'm Atmosera's data security lead. I have about 10 years of cybersecurity experience, 3 of which being cloud security with an emphasis on data security and more recently AI security. And I've been with Atmosera for about 1.5 years, and I've been helping clients alleviate their risks and challenges relating to the data security space.
Thank you, Colby. And I'm Dennis. I'm the security practice lead with Atmosera. I've been in the consulting world for a little over 20 years as a systems integrator and focused on the Microsoft security stack for that duration. I've held data security leadership roles in my past, and I'm delighted to be here as the overall facilitator of the conversation. I'm also delighted to introduce Rachel Snowback, our colleague from the marketing side who has set all this up. Thank you very much for all you do, Rachel. Okay, we're going to jump in, and I just want to let you all know that we're going to take questions at the end. Excuse me. So please put your questions in the chat window, and we'll leave some time at the end for Colby and I to address those. Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't mention why it is that we're here today and the corporate sponsor that brings us here. Colby and I and Rachel, we work for Atmosera. Atmosera has been approaching, or we're approaching 30 years of enabling digital transformations. We do specialize in the Microsoft clouds, both Azure and M365. And from a security point of view, we focus on enabling users with seamless security across all the different use cases. We do handle app development, analytics, DevOps infrastructure, as well as security. So we're well informed about what those use cases are. Security is a part of everything we do at Atmosera because it's part of everything that you do. Security is part of everything you do because everyone's systems are under attack. And if not if, but when, there may be a breach, right? And readiness for that breach is important. For us, from our point of view, that includes 2 mindsets. One is establishing the protections and the state of what one might think is secure. But over the course of time, you have to be resilient to attacks and changes. So this is actually a lifestyle, not so much as a destination. Right? The things at risk, of course, in the scenario where you're deploying Copilot or Azure OpenAI are the same things that are at risk when you're deploying any kind of application. So it takes both the mindset of how do we protect your data, how do you protect your users, how do you protect your devices, but then of course, how do you keep those protections in place over time? How do you evolve those protections as the threat changes as well? This is all part of what we'll cover today. So just to get started with this scenario, I want to talk to you about 2 of the 3 scenarios that are outlined in this slide. Thanks to the new ISO framework around AI, right, we have these roles. I think there are about 8 roles, but there's 3 that I want to draw out today and 2 that we're going to focus on in particular. So this is meant to establish some common vocabulary for us for the call. The first thing I want to talk about is what it means to be an AI producer. Someone or a company, right, that actually develops and creates AI technologies. The producer, right? Colby's going to go over some examples in a second, but as you might imagine, the producer has special responsibilities, special vulnerabilities to attend to. There is a middle player between the producer and the consumer, though. That's the provider. In the case of Copilot and Azure OpenAI, that's Microsoft. Microsoft is in the middle. They actually don't produce the AI models, right? They consume it. They're produced by OpenAI. And Microsoft provides that to companies, and it's a different kind of risk scenario, right? That they have to attend to versus those of us who consume those services. Now, if you're consuming Copilot, there's vulnerabilities, which we're going to talk about. If you're providing an AI-enabled application through Azure OpenAI, that's a separate set of vulnerabilities. We'll talk about those as well. Colby, walk us through some examples, would you?
Sure. So here we have some examples of the three scenarios Dennis mentioned. First, we have the AI producers. These are the most popular and prominent producers of AI models. That includes, as we all know, OpenAI, also known as ChatGPT. Then we have ones like Google DeepMind and Anthropic. Some of the more popular and prominent AI providers are going to be Azure AI and Azure OpenAI. And just to differentiate the two, Azure AI consists of a bundle of AI services such as machine learning, cognitive services, text, speech, and also bot services. And then Azure OpenAI provides the OpenAI language models that we know as GPT-3 or DALL-E, and they bring those to the Azure environment. Some of the other popular AI providers are going to be the Amazon-based ones and also Google. And then third, we have the AI assistants that we all use, definitely ChatGPT and all the various Microsoft Copilots out there in the wild. And some of the other popular ones are going to be your Google Gemini and then Anthropic's Claude AI.
Okay, so depending upon your circumstance, you may be subject to some of these vulnerabilities, which I'll tease out more so than others. When it comes to serving as a provider or consumer, right, there's particular vulnerabilities that you want to focus on, namely, data security. This is really all about data security, of course. There is a separate set of vulnerabilities that many have to manage, like the hallucination and data hygiene, and things like that, which are specific to the application itself. We're really not focusing on that today. We're focusing on the ecosystem and corporate data security overall. More so the scenario where you're consuming services by consuming the Copilot service itself offered by Microsoft, and are providing an application that's AI enabled using Azure OpenAI. Right, so the first thing that we want to tease out is around data exfiltration. Either of these amazing services with their complete and effective consumption of your corporate data are going to render that data in a sophisticated way never seen before, right? That's what we're after. That's the benefit. But it also, of course, is the risk. If that data isn't sorted, if it isn't echoed or secured, if it's not identified based on its sensitivity, it will most likely go in areas where you don't intend. So you would have unintended access. You'd have unauthorized access because the veil would be lifted, right? Just because a user can't find some data in a particular database, or they can't find that data in a SharePoint site, right? It doesn't mean that Copilot can't. Right, or that your OpenAI based data doesn't have that data as part of its model and then surfaces it that way. So data exfiltration is of paramount concern. That's the primary concern. And there are some sub concerns underneath that we'll be talking about as well. Data poisoning is worth an honorable mention as well. Data poisoning would be where that data is, your corporate data is accessed unintentionally, and then someone changes it. Someone makes an unauthorized change, and that data is now poisoned going forward for other consumers. So that can have all kinds of unintended impact. Get a sound issue here. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Loud and clear.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we're not focusing just on external actors, by the way. We're also going to acknowledge internal actors as well. So you need to be mindful of both of those scenarios. What's this third use case, Colby?
Sure. So we have also a third scenario that everyone wishes to avoid, which is oversharing sensitive data that you assumed was locked down, but it's not. Here we have a scenario of oversharing where we can pretend that there's a account compromise or even a insider threat, and that user is leveraging, let's say, Copilot, and they're trying to find and potentially extract sensitive data from an organization. So now we can see that AI can surface this data in seconds, whereas previously it was quite difficult to do so. This new AI threat can lead to a larger impact, what we call a blast radius, if a security incident were to occur. These types of events can potentially expose sensitive data such as financial data, salaries. It can be healthcare related documents, intellectual property, and in these types of data leakage and data exposure could potentially lead to worse things, fines, and loss of reputation, and so on. So let's take a look at how we can manage and mitigate these types of risks from happening.
Yeah, and let's get started with managing the risk of being a consumer and a provider, just to clarify what we're going to focus on, right? Consuming using a Copilot or providing using Azure OpenAI. I like this model that Microsoft provides because it begins to show what's needed and who's responsible. Those who have been in the cloud services area for quite some time are familiar with Microsoft's shared responsibility model for cloud services, and this one is an iteration of that. Right? Now it starts off with the different kinds of things that you do with AI, use, the application itself, and the platform at the bottom. Right? A little bit of narrative in the middle there around activities that are grouped in that space. And then basically who is responsible for what, the dark blue being Microsoft, the light blue being us as consumers, right? So I like the model because it's a starting point for this sort of thing that does take into account the different kinds of roles that we would play. Now, using this model, we can jump forward, for example, as a consumer of AI in the situation or scenario that involves Copilot, you can see what Microsoft will pick up on your behalf and what it assumes you're responsible for, right, in that last tower, the SaaS Copilot thing. Now, I've taken that list and unpacked it and listed security functions that you're accountable for, that you're responsible for, even if you're consuming Copilot services. In the past, right, a lot of subscribers who are considering Microsoft services have missed these sorts of things. In this particular case, right, you want to make it explicit, because if you get this wrong, right, there's a larger impact. As Colby mentioned, the blast radius could be much bigger than if you get something else wrong, right, on the data security side. Well, from a Azure OpenAI point of view, right, where you are deploying more into Microsoft's cloud, the responsibilities do shift. Right. This may look familiar overall because of, as I mentioned, it's based upon the cloud responsibility matrix from some time ago. And the point is, there's still plenty of work to do. And what you're looking at here is the list from Copilot with the additional responsibilities you have for the additional security functions, right? That really are part and parcel of any data-based solution in the cloud. So it's a helpful roadmap, so to speak, kind of a menu or punch list of things that you want to tend to. Now, to do all that you just saw, you can draw on the Deming wheel, which people have been doing for decades now. The demo wheel is the plan, do, study, act scenario, and mapping these sorts of projects onto that, because I think it's a helpful and universal kind of baseline. We have threat modeling all the way up through security governance as cornerstones or milestones, you might say, for accommodating and the new risks of generative AI, right, and the remediations that are required. I'll just focus on security governance here in particular. I'm assuming most of this is probably fits within your intention already. I'm gonna start with and highlight security governance, because if you don't get that right, all of this other stuff is probably going to fault, right? It's the security governance aspect of this sort of event, and by that I mean policy, standards, and baselines, right? That really give an organization that consensus and that North Star on how AI should be and can be used in the organization. You might consider that kind of a top level control. The second thing I would mention before I move to the next slide is around risk assessment. So understanding what your risks are is what's going to empower you to remediate them. And if you don't understand what they are, then I would point you to the security governance section, right? So there are some governance assets that we'll review in a second that will really facilitate your planning there. Oh, this is a bit of a textbook sort of scenario, right, where we start with threat modeling and end with security governance. It doesn't mean that this is the model you should pick up. You may already be one or two steps into this. You may be already at residual risk assessment and moving into security governance. This model should be flexible, and in most cases, I think we find a little bit of a different scenario. Colby, would you tell us about that?
Sure. So when talking about Copilot deployments in particular, where the data and services are already in place as it's using the M365 estate and all the solutions, some of the clients are focusing on just assessing the risks and protections for known threats and vulnerable locations, and then using those against the governance that's already in place. And then once the protections are deployed, the idea would be to continuously improve by restarting that full Deming cycle that Dennis just showed in the previous slide. And Dennis, real quick, you want to, the screen is kind of cut in half.
Oh,
kind of there's a resizing. Oh, it's closer. Yeah, that's it. You have it. Perfect.
okay. All right, thank you, Colby. As I mentioned, governance is a big part of this. It's an essential tool to establish what a firm can and can't do with AI. The good news here is that there's a lot of maturity in terms of available, freely available, and for a small fee kind of framework sort of stuff from venerable authoritative sources like ISO and NIST. At a minimum, understanding what's outlawed is useful for both legal and risk managers. And if you're involved in a generative AI project, I hope you understand that you are a risk manager no matter what. That's definitely something in no matter what part you play in the project, right? You do need to be mindful of risk. At its best, governance can also fast track adoption and do so in a sustainable way so that you're not looking backwards, right? Using these frameworks, you should be aware of the risks, all of them, so to speak. There's always new ones around the corner, but all the ones that are basically acknowledged by the industry, by these worldwide organizations. And if you're informed of those, then you're empowered to actually move forward, and the risk management framework can actually help you move forward with remediations. And that is required for diligence, right? And if you don't have that diligence, right, you might find yourself in a position where one CISO has put it as indefensible, right? So starting off with these frameworks, I can't emphasize enough how important these punch lists, these frameworks are in empowering your organization to move forward with these services with clear, confident paths, which you'll definitely need, right, in the following year and the subsequent iterations of your consumption with AI. So if you don't start off with governance, many don't, right, just make sure that you get to it as soon as you can. All right, well, let's talk about the control planes. Purview is the star of the show, but it's surrounded by a supporting cast. Let's start off to the left with Entra. So Microsoft's Entra service, the identity as a service, right, where all of our usernames and passwords are stored. It also provides a list of other kinds of authentication and authorization services, including zero trust access, where a session is actually scored for its risk. And based upon that risk score, you may be able to do this or that, or not do this or that. Stepping into the Copilot and Azure OpenAI layers, I'll mention the commercial data protection in Copilot. That basically, which comes by default, it prohibits or prevents Microsoft from capturing session information, recording it, and using that information to train. So your information, your session information, is your session information. It doesn't persist in any Microsoft data center. You do have the option, and we would recommend that you capture that, right? But that's your choice. The Copilot service itself will not do that. On the Azure OpenAI side, you have Defender for Cloud, which is a platform for posture management, security posture management, as well as workload security management. It's a suite of tools, and I'll start with DevOps. Defender for Cloud's DevOps stack. If you have a DevOps solution or a secure DevOps solution, then that's great. But the Azure one in particular grabs that telemetry around developing applications and integrates it with all of the other security services that Defender for Cloud captures, renders that in one dashboard, and or integrates that with your security event management service. So when you're developing an app, I think the DevOps side is a key vulnerability that you want to tackle. Azure makes it very easy. Defender for Cloud makes it very easy to deploy policies, right, across the data infrastructure, all of the different data services. And there are unique and distinct services for roughly, I think, over 20 different services. I've listed some here that are more relevant, but there's a lot here. It's very much a holistic and platform-based control plane. Now, things get interesting with SharePoint and Purview. I think part of the difference here is that SharePoint and Purview, unlike, say, Entra, they have Copilot and AI-specific improvements, some of which are actually becoming available this month. Right? On the SharePoint side, there are some high-level configurations that you would make in the Teams or OneDrive configuration for M365 and even for SharePoint, which basically mean, hey, would you accept guests, or do you enable external sharing? What kind of share links might be produced? A very high-level enterprise kind of coarse-grained configurations. But that's not where all the fun really is. The fun is really in the advanced management option for SharePoint, SAM as it's known, where you can block downloads for SharePoint and for OneDrive. You can deploy conditional access policies specific to a particular site, which you can't do with Entra alone. You have access policies, robust access policies at each site level optionally, right? Where you can fine tune access to the Copilot service or via the Copilot service as well. Can't just block it, right? You can do that with SAM. You can label the content. You can encrypt data on egress, right? If a certain kind of data is detected. And then for lifecycle management of a site itself, there is a new inactive sites policy. Just note that may not be interesting to you in security as much as it is to a SharePoint admin who would be glad to have an old site retired automatically or through a workflow. Right? But from a security point of view, whatever site is archived will no longer appear in Copilot. So you can manage your attack surface using that inactive site policy. There's also ownership policies that report on sites. This is in private preview. That report on sites in terms of whether the ownership is beyond your tolerance, or if there is an insufficient amount of ownership, which is an important part about managing your exposure over time. If you have more owners, right, they can actually enable more rights, maybe inadvertently, and then that could present a problem when that data surfaced in Copilot. Last I'll mention is the data, the lifecycle policies around oversharing in particular, which leverage machine learning to compare and contrast your policies against sites that don't have those policies, to let you know what content might be out there that you should be managing via policy that you're not currently managing. I mean, these are amazingly powerful and complete controls that are either in SharePoint today or coming this month. Right. Moving on to Purview, kind of the star of the show. As SharePoint, Purview has been enhanced with AI-specific integrations, right? So the DLP policy that as part of the new AI hub, in particular, is a very quick way of getting to know what sort of interactions your users are having with AI services of all kinds, right? Up to 400 different different AI services right now are managed via this policy, and I'm sure that list is going to grow. And if you deploy this policy via AI Hub, you can get that telemetry, you can do some assessments, but you can also detect immediately whether someone is maybe sharing too much corporate information based upon how you've designed the policy, and warn the individual about what the potential consequences. And then you can also deploy a label right then and there. We'll talk about labeling in a second. The labeling of sensitive data would prevent unauthorized users from doing things like forwarding the information, etc. We don't recommend that you deploy labeling this way. It's better to do it using an enterprise service versus this DLP policy, but it is an option. So in addition to the AI Hub, information protection where the labeling actually happens, that's a service within Purview, that's been enhanced to accommodate AI particular situations. Pilot sessions are now being inspected by Purview's information protection service, and it can detect when sensitive information is being surfaced in a response, right? And block access if that's the right thing to do. So whatever settings you put into Purview will be picked up by Copilot and enforced in those sessions dynamically. In addition, right, the data loss prevention and insider risk management are kind of key services that round out the accommodation of a Copilot session. Maybe the data is not sensitive, but maybe there's some unwelcome language being used, and you have an insider risk management policy that's scanning for that kind of that kind of language. Or if you're in the financial industry, you have some insider risk management policies that are specific to sharing financial information. In either case, right, those insider risk policies are now part of the Copilot inspection session. So just like sensitive information, sensitive chats, for example, would be picked up by Purview, right, and managed according to your policies. In terms of data compliance, I'll just say that you have this ecosystem of collaboration services, and when it comes to forensics and or legal case involvement, right, having all of that information at your disposal empowers your legal team. It empowers your compliance teams. And Microsoft Purview has this great platform for that. Well, Copilot and prompting, right, as well as the responses, that can be all part of those services. So depending on the size of your organization or the industry that you're in, this could round out what you're required to do per regulations. It's also good practice, right, overall, to have these as options, because you never know when you need that information. And then how long you retain this information is depending on your needs, right? And using data governance, you can retain this for years if that's what's necessary. And by this, I mean the prompts and the responses that Copilot would share. Well, all of this, I've got the arrows going back and forth at the bottom. All of this is deployable into SharePoint. It's deployable into your email and OneDrive. It's also deployable into your data stack in Azure OpenAI. So at the record level, right, you could be detecting sensitive information. So as your applications fill up databases with activity, right, that information can be scanned for sensitivity and or insider risk management type policies. Right, having said all of that, right, we're going to demo this a little bit here in a moment. I did want to say that along our Deming wheel, right, I mean, there's 2 points where you really need to focus on validating what your need is and understanding the risks. Right? So how do you do that? Microsoft native tooling really empowers you to do this, right? From an entry point of view, group management is definitely a way to figure out whether you're over provisioned in terms of ownership or even access to content. Defender for Cloud includes Azure policy, and if you have Azure services at the base level, Defender for Cloud is available at its base level, which would include Azure policy. And in Azure policy, there is a free benchmark, which is aligned to industry standards, which would give you a report on all of your resources in Azure and tell you whether you meet the industry standards for security. That's free, right? It's a passive mode only, right? And it's a great way to start. In addition to that, the Azure stack for OpenAI includes additional AI-specific policies that you can layer on top of that. In the SharePoint world, right, you have usage reports, which can tell you, how many site owners you have and who's seeing what. In the advanced management side, in the SAM side, right, you have detections that would go into how the policies, or I'm sorry, how the files are actually being used. Let's see, let me get back. My apologies. Yeah, and so SAM will actually help you understand what is overshared. So it has a very interesting oversharing report, which will basically use machine learning, compare sites against others to produce a refined understanding of what oversharing is. Now, caution you, like anything that's produced with AI, right, and this is kind of a entry-level AI based report, you do need to interface with your business to make sure that what it finds is actually what's happening. There's some false positive things that can creep into your action plan, and you want to make sure that you're working closely with your business to make sure that you don't over-engineer or under-engineer. Data access governance comes with SAM, actually, but it's also separately available. It allows you to report in a very robust way across lots of different dynamics around sharing. So it's invaluable from that point of view. Who's sharing what? And does that person who's now got access to this information, can they edit that, and potentially poison things? So that's an important aspect as well in terms of assessments. On the Purview side, we already talked about the DOP policy itself and what it can surface around how people are using AI. You can also understand how the browser overall might be interacting with other AI services outside of Copilot. On the data security side, we're going to see some things that Colby's going to share in a moment around how content and sensitive information is seen from Purview and potentially from Copilot. And you can basically try before you buy, so to speak. You can definitely identify that sensitive information and determine whether Copilot will pick that up and distribute it in unwanted ways. around the data compliance and e-discovery and audit, really, we have that there because those really enable you to do the legal and forensic kinds of things you need to do over the course of time. That's more the resilient story. So having said all of that, talk through all of the control planes and all of the quick and dirty native assessment tools, let's go ahead and cut over to Colby's demo. Hopefully you're ready for me, Colby.
Yep, I am ready.
Oh my God.
Can you, Dennis, can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
All right. Is it still on my usage screen?
It's on your usage screen.
Perfect. All righty, so let's go ahead and take a look at where to begin when assessing your Microsoft 365 data state. In particular, we're going to start with the one of the SharePoint reports. This is within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Here you can pull other kind of usage reports for other services, but we're going to take a look at SharePoint. There's two kinds of reports, one for activity, but in our use case for assessment, we're going to leverage the site usage report. This report can go back to up to about 6 months of data of sites being used to get that full picture of how many files have been used, created, and just overall site settings here. So you get some analytics as well. It allows you to export your entire SharePoint site state into a CSV document. Just to give a little demo of what that looks like when you export that report. You get all of the site IDs, you can get the site URLs associated to a SharePoint site. Mine in particular, Microsoft does default the reports to not include the site URLs due to data privacy and compliance reasons. Somebody would have to go in, and a global administrator would have to go in and flip the switch to include site URLs. Regardless, you can get a lot of really great information from each SharePoint site, and you get a closer look at what their control plane looks like, what kind of external sharing is going on, if it's enabled, if that site has unmanaged device policies, where it's restricted or not, the locations, and then we can also take a closer look at the more of the data plane. How many files are tied to each site? How active are they? How many views are there? Are there any, what kind of links are associated to these SharePoint sites? So you can gather all of this information for your SharePoint sites for risk assessment and review. This is just one report that we leverage to assess. There's also within the SharePoint Admin Center, as Dennis mentioned, there is the data access governance features, and the data access governance feature really consists of several reports. The first one being sharing links. And what it does is that it can generate reports based off of the last 4 weeks. It can identify any SharePoint sites where users have created any one links, where that can include internal users and external users can access the link and access that site or document and have controls to edit. Then it also includes people in your organization. That excludes any sort of guest users or external users, and you can quickly get these kinds of reports. Specific people is when users can just specify a certain user to, whether internal or external. So it can gather these sites, it can generate a report, you can review the sharing links data and see, for example, I have a financial team SharePoint site, and there has been sharing links created for external users, And we're now seeing that this could pose as a potential risk of oversharing, and users coming in from unmanaged devices externally can have full access with these kinds of sharing links. So that's one report we can use to identify oversharing and risks. There's also sensitivity labels where you can just gather all the different documents that allows you to see where all the sensitive files are located at, where your most sensitive sites are. That's one form. There's another form here in Purview that we will discuss in a minute. And the last data access governance report is the content shared with everyone except external users. This, I know it's a mouthful, but the everyone except external users is a Microsoft built-in dynamic group, and it's not accessible through an Entra ID. It's built in. It's only really visible through SharePoint and maybe PowerShell. And what that is just a group that includes all of your organization's users except for guest users and any sort of external user. So with this report, you can gather information on the last 4 weeks. You can take a look at sites that are sharing to external or everyone except external users. And so you can get site level sharing, and then you can also go down to the more granular level where you can get a report type with sites with specific content shared. So you can get that more granular level of detail for review. And so those are some of the SharePoint related reports that we leverage when assessing. And then we also, I'll pivot over to Purview. And within Purview, a really great feature that we use when assessing for Copilot readiness is the information protection solution. In particular, that I'm showing in this demo, we're going to be leveraging the Microsoft built-in sensitive info types, trainable classifiers. Sensitive info type, if you're unfamiliar, is just can be like alphanumeric string or some kind of sensitive data string used. Sensitive data being used that Purview continuously crawls and scans your Purview estate, and it can start to flag that sensitive info with the sensitive info types known as SITs. And with that, we can take a look and see the different Microsoft 365 locations where that data type is located, in particular where most organizations have a bulk of their data state is going to be within SharePoint. I'm just going to use the social security number sensitive info type as an example that I want to look and see what locations have this sensitive data at. In SharePoint in particular, I only have one site. It's tied to HR, which that's going to be common and typically approved. But if we had if I'm working in a larger organization where there can be hundreds of HR sites and that data can then be linked and overshared to other sites, you have that kind of drift of data. And this Content Explorer is a perfect tool to use to identify where that sensitive data has drifted elsewhere, and then you can remediate and remove that sensitive data and help reduce that attack surface, as Dennis has mentioned earlier. So those are some of the reports that we use for assessing risks for SharePoint. There's also the AI Hub, which is a fairly new solution that Microsoft has protect and potentially protect out to help organizations detect users interacting with Copilot or with some sort of third-party AI application. This is exactly what AI Hub can do. There are some prerequisites involved. Dennis mentioned the Purview audit feature, which helps ingest the Microsoft 365 data and defended for endpoint logs and bringing them into Purview for analysis review and into these various tools. You also need to have the Microsoft Purview browser extensions installed and making sure your devices are onboarded into Purview. So once you have all of the prerequisites complete, you start to get AI Hub will analyze with the templated policies. And what that looks like once it's fully implemented, you can now monitor in a centralized dashboard all of the total interactions over time with Copilot. You can see how many visits users are having with other third-party AI sites. My favorite is in the data section, where you can start to see, okay, well, what kind of sensitive data are users pasting into these third-party apps? We're seeing, in some cases, we can see people are using and pasting medical information into Copilot or a third-party app, or even potentially a developer using company source code and pasting it into third-party generative AI apps. So here you can have a centralized view of that information. You can also see potentially unethical AI interactions, which are tied to the communication compliance policies, and that can identify things like some user trying to use targeted harassment behavior with Copilot and manipulate Copilot to do those kinds of things, or another user trying to do some sort of corporate sabotage where they're acting maliciously. The communication compliance policy can identify and detect those types of unethical behaviors, and then it can come here into the centralized view. The last section is in the reports blade is the insider risk management features within or for generative AI apps, and that's where it can identify certain abnormal activities where users are all of a sudden, going to AI sites hundreds and hundreds of times a day, various sites that may or may not be approved. Insider risk management can help identify and create alerts based off of those activities. So what I've just showed is some of the reports on the SharePoint side and on the Purview side of how we can help assess our M365 footprint and gear towards mitigating AI threats. Now I'll pivot over to the control side in relation to to Dennis's control plane slide, and we're going to start off with a little demo on what it looks like within data loss prevention for AI. So this is a built-in template policy, but it can be tuned to fit your needs. We're just going to quickly come through here. Like I mentioned, you have to have the browser extensions installed on your users' machines in order for these signals to be detected. Defender for Endpoint is also a requirement. Taking a closer look at the rules, you can customize your own rules. I've customized one to block credit cards to Google Gemini, but Microsoft's template rule is the audit of sensitive data. And this is really a starting point for organizations to start detecting any sensitive data being uploaded into AI apps. And here you can really pick and choose any kind of sensitive info type you want to look for. If you're a healthcare organization, you can help hone in on healthcare related files or text being used in the AI app interactions. And with those, you can create a block with override rules where a user may have to require justification, or you can also do hardline blocking in the AI application. So whenever a user tries to paste some sort of sensitive company data, it's going to be immediately blocked by Purview's data loss prevention measures tied to that browser extension. So it won't even hit that third-party app. It will be blocked before it can even get there. That's one example on the for AI app usage. When we're talking about Copilot in particular, I'll come back to the information protection blade, and here we can create sensitivity labels to help. And Dennis mentioned this earlier, where you can leverage sensitivity labels to stop Copilot from accessing that data. I have two examples here that I'll show everyone that you can use to help prevent Copilot interactions. Let's say you have highly sensitive information that should not be touched whatsoever by Copilot. You can come in and create sensitivity labels to help make sure you help complete those controls. And here we come into the access controls. We specify let users assign permissions. You can encrypt it. And what this does is this can be on a user basis where your employees can have that discretion. They can say, hey, anyone accessing this document gets read-only rights. Anything beyond that it can't be done. And in order for Copilot to actually go through, like the user themselves can go in and read that document, but Copilot won't be able to ingest that document or return any sort of information from that document. It requires extract and copy level of rights within information rights management. So that's one way you can go about protecting, a user can go about protecting sensitive data from an AI app. Another one is with the use of double key encryption. If your organization configures and sets that up, then any sort of labels with DKE on it will be restricted, and Copilot will not have access to any sort of encryption with DKE. Those are two, so with the DLP and information protection labeling, those are two controls that you can implement in your organization to help safeguard data from oversharing and potential AI threats. We'll come over now to the SharePoint side and take a look at the advanced management features that Dennis has talked about, and to give more of a visual for those descriptions. There are the block download for SharePoint and OneDrives, so that can potentially block all internal and external users from downloading any sort of files. You can, and this is done through PowerShell, but it can also include some exclusion type rules where you can maybe have owners only having access to download those types of files across that SharePoint site, things like that. You can specify a specific user group to help exclude, so it doesn't restrict everyone and make that SharePoint site useless. Some other ones that Dennis mentioned, to give a little bit more context there, is with the conditional access policies within Azure. You can leverage your existing policies and kind of break it out even further and create what's called authentication contexts. And you can specify, let's say, your highly sensitive sites, your HR sites, or certain financial sites. Maybe you want additional security guardrails for those sites. With this SharePoint Advanced Management feature, you can do that, and you can lock it down based off of a managed device or maybe somebody's certain IP range, things like that. You can now leverage and lock it down based off of a site in authentication context. Some of the other more exciting and interesting policies are going to be the site lifecycle management ones. The site ownership policy just hit public preview within the past week or so, so it's very, very new to the public. I'll start with the inactive site policy, where it's a really great feature on the data lifecycle management side of things, where it can help get rid of those inactive sites that are no longer in use. These are all automated, so it relieves a lot of work effort for the SharePoint admins or even security admins of reviewing these things. And so you can set the inactive period from 1 month up to 6 months, and you can once nobody has, in the event nobody answers it and it's deemed no longer in use, it can automatically archive that site for you. For the site ownership policy, you can come in here, and what this policy does is that you can help get that Microsoft best practice of 2 site owners minimum for each SharePoint site. So the days of having to manually manage all the various SharePoint site owners for each individual site. That's going to be no longer a thing now with this awesome and new feature. It's going to automatically do that for you, and you can scope it any which way you want. You can select the types of SharePoint sites you want to include in this policy. It allows some customization here for the policy scope, and then you can come into the configurations. You can make sure that there's a minimum of 2 site owners across your whole tenant, and if there's not, it can help notify the one remaining site owner, or it can start to, and this is the more exciting part, is it can notify the active site members. So if you have a SharePoint site where there's hundreds of members, there's no owners, you don't know who the owner should be, you can come in here, and SharePoint Advanced Management can do this work for you and identify, based off of user activity, the most active site members, and then notify them of and recommend that they be the site owners. If there's no action, nobody wants to own up to that site, you can come in and then go through and you can force the rule to set the site to read only. And then after that, like Dennis has mentioned, Copilot won't be able to access that data. It's read only, it can't be extracted, and it starts to push that site into that archive. The last control that I'm going to talk about today within SharePoint is going to be the site level access restrictions. This is, we call it it's a restricted access control known as a RAC, and this is a really great feature for removing those risks tied to oversharing, where you can automatically assign a M365 group to a SharePoint site. Let's say it has hundreds and hundreds of users, but you know only one team should have access to that site. You can lock it down to that one site, and then you can go and lock it out to the one group, and everyone else loses that access. It's locked down to that one group. And that is all of the controls that I have to share today. Guess I'll pivot it back over to you, Dennis.
Sounds good. Thank you, Colby. Let's see. Did we get back to the Prezzo? Yes, I think we did. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and close this out quickly, and then we'll take questions if anyone wants to stick around for that. For the next steps, right, having seen how to assess, perhaps project controls into your environment in advance of and in coordination of Copilot, right, in Azure OpenAI, right, we have these kind of milestones laid out for you. Regardless of where you are, if you need support, you can always lean on Microsoft, right, and or a partner like Atmosera. In fact, there is a certain way to start this process. Here it's listed at the bottom with the star, which is Microsoft funded. You may qualify for that, and you can either lean on Microsoft or a partner like Atmosera to figure out if that's an option for you. So you shouldn't let budgeting get in the way. But if you haven't guessed, my favorite and most important part of this milestone plan here that you see before you is governance. I would implore you to take advantage of what ISO or NIST have done in terms of establishing the full set of risks that you should be aware of and potentially be remediating. I have a couple of resources here that basically were important for us in our journey. If you were to click on these things and read a little bit, you'd see where all of this material really comes from. This is a launching point, a starting point. There is an awful lot to cover. The governance workbooks, et cetera, have hundreds of pages. So it's a lot of material. You don't need to learn it all, right? A little bit is better than nothing. And glancing through a document is better than not seeing it at all. It's all about empowerment. It's all about understanding and awareness. You have to have that before you can actually take action. I want to thank you again for joining us. When I reiterate again that ISO and NIST are your friends, they're great places to start. That the Microsoft native tools will help you assess your risks and also at the same time provide a great control plane for security controls, specifically for Copilot in Azure, OpenAI. On behalf of Rachel and Colby, thank you very much. We're here if you have any questions you want to throw in the chat window. I think there are a couple that are there already.
I do see one question from Larry. He says, does Intune work with? Yes, it does. And there's just, can't remember if the exact setting is in Purview itself or it's going to be in the security admin center. It's more of just a flip of a switch, but yeah, it does accept.
You want to break that down
just
a little bit, well. Like, yeah, what aspects? So as far as labeling sensitive information goes, right? I think that works, right? If you're using, say, Outlook in your mobile phone, right? Or the Edge browser on the mobile phone. It may be like app specific ultimately. I think you need to be a little bit mindful of the particulars of what it is that the Intune managed devices is. Is it a laptop? Is it a phone? And what kind of relationship does that device have? Is it fully managed or are just some of the apps managed? In either case, right, you've got it either full or partial coverage. Okay. Was there a question about external users having access to Copilot? Or has that been addressed already? Can someone who has gained access to your system use the Copilot for their data exfiltration? Absolutely, yeah. It'd be probably a dream come true for them, unless you have the data security controls that Colby showed you already in place. Okay, thanks for your questions, Larry. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry.
All right. If there's nothing else, thank you all again very much kindly. Best of luck on your adventures with Copilot and generative AI overall. Thanks from Atmosera.
Thank you, everybody.